At family dinner, my stepmom said, "Families share money." That night, my bank flagged unauthorized access to my account. I was done being polite. I gazed directly at my father across the kitchen table and uttered what I had been keeping back for years. "If I hear another line from your wife concerning my money, there will be no more nice chats. I'll personally explain where she stands and why my money isn't hers." The room became silent. The fridge hummed. My stepmother's coffee cup had frozen halfway to her lips. My father glanced at me, as if he no longer recognized his own daughter. That was when everything changed. I grew up believing that families broke apart by shouting, slamming doors, and screaming matches, which neighbors gossip about. I didn't realize they could break slowly, one polite smile at a time. One delicate comment slipped under the table like a knife. My mother died when I was 14. Cancer is fast, aggressive, and unforgiving. In early summer, she complained of a dull aching in her side. By late fall, I was standing at her grave in borrowed black shoes that pinched my heels, being told how strong I was. I despised that word. Strong meant you couldn't fall apart. My father waited less than a year before introducing us to Margaret Hale. She was not cruel, not openly. That was the problem. She smiled too much, whispered softly, and caressed my arm as she spoke to me as if we were already intimate. She served casseroles to neighbors and wine at dinner gatherings. Everybody liked her. Everyone claimed my father was fortunate to have found happiness again. By then I was 18, old enough to know better but still young enough to keep quiet. When I departed for basic training 3 years later, my father held me tightly and told me how proud he was. Margaret Hale cried just enough to appear supportive without smudging her mascara. "We'll take care of everything here," she explained. I trusted her when she said, "You just focus on your future." Or perhaps I needed to. The military taught me discipline, patience, and control. It taught me to listen more than speak, to read a room and to be patient. Those lessons rescued me later, even if I didn't realize it at the time. And the first remark concerning my money came during my 3rd year of duty. We were on video call. Margaret Hale sat next to my father on the couch, her hand lightly resting on his knee, as if she needed to remind the world where she belonged. "You must be doing well now," she remarked, smiling. "With your pay, your housing allowance, all those bonuses," I said with a laugh. "I manage." "Well," she added, "it's good to know the family has security." I didn't like the way she said family. The remarks continued, always posed as a worry and always polite. "Have you considered long-term planning? Wouldn't it be easier if your father helped you manage things while you were so young? Money can be overwhelming." My father would nod gently, averting my gaze. When I returned home on leave, I noticed some changes. My mother's desk was replaced by a sleek glass table, which Margaret Hale claimed made the room feel cleaner. My mom's old file cabinet, which held everything from insurance papers to birthday cards, was vanished. When I inquired about it, Margaret Hale waved her hand. "Oh, the old things we organized. You don't have to worry about it." I began to worry instantly. One evening after dinner, Margaret Hale brought out dessert and casually suggested, "We should really talk about consolidating accounts. It just makes sense for families." I laid my fork down. "My accounts are okay." She grinned without concern. "Of course, just a thought." That night I sat awake in my childhood bedroom, staring at the tiny outline on the wall where my mother's calendar once hung. I felt like a guest in a place that was once mine. The breaking point did not come from shouting. It arrived with papers. While I was on duty, I received a bank notification via email. A typical security alert, attempted access, and wrong verification. I froze. Except for myself, no one had access to my information. When I called the bank, they inquired if I had lately allowed anyone to assist with my finances. I had not. They stated a query regarding my father's address. That was when something within me hardened. I went home on leave 10 days later. I did not accuse. I did not raise my voice. I was watching. Margaret Hale spoke more than usual about bills, investments, how expensive it was to keep the house, and how my father deserved to unwind after everything he'd been through. She finally said it. "Well, your money is already part of this household." I looked at my father. He did not correct her. That's when I stood up, walked to the table, and delivered the words that had been brewing in my chest for years, calmly, clearly, and without rage. "If I hear another word from your wife about my money," I told him, locking eyes, "there will be no more nice chats. I'll explain exactly where she stands and why my money isn't hers. Do you understand?" Margaret Hale's smile vanished. My father's face had lost its color. He nodded slightly. But I already knew that comprehension was not the same as respect. And I had had enough of asking for respect. I didn't expect things to change overnight after that warning. People like Margaret Hale did not flee because they were confronted. They adjusted. They gave a tighter smile. They waited for a better view. For several weeks, everything was quiet. Too quiet. Margaret Hale ceased mentioning money directly. Instead, she focused on stories, long meandering chats about stress, responsibilities, and how difficult it was to keep everything together while I was away. She never asked for anything directly. She did not have to. She let the insinuation linger in the air, like dampness before a storm. Meanwhile, my father grew smaller. I observed it in the way he deferred to her in discussions, how he'd look at her before answering even the most basic queries. I'd find him mid-sentence shifting direction because she shifted in her seat or cleared her throat. It was subtle, but once you noticed it, you couldn't unsee it. The military had taught me something vital. Control is not always achieved through force. Conditioning is often the cause. Margaret Hale challenged the barrier again, but not at home. It was at a family gathering, one of those long dinners that distant relatives appeared, pretending we were closer than we actually were. The kind with too much food, too much wine, and just enough time to bring out old resentments. I was sitting at the table when Margaret Hale laughed softly and told my aunt, "Well, with her military income, we're very lucky. Not many families have that kind of stability these days." My fork paused halfway to my mouth. I didn't look at Margaret Hale, I looked at my father. He was smiling. "She's doing well." That was it. That was the crack. Later that night I took him aside. We stood in the hallway outside my former bedroom. The door closed. The sounds of talking were muffled behind us. "I established a boundary," I said gently. She crossed it. "She was just talking," he said, massaging his forehead. "You are reading too much into it." "I'm reading exactly what's there," I explained. "And I'm asking you only once to handle it." He exhaled. "You do not realize how complicated things are." That sentence explained everything. Complicated generally indicated that excuses had already been made. A few days later, another alert arrived from the bank. This was not an access attempt, it was a request for information about the beneficiary. Someone had inquired about the process for adding an authorized user. I did not challenge them, I documented everything: dates, times, statements, feedback, emails, and screenshots. I'd learned long ago that emotions dissipate. Records did not. Margaret Hale became bolder after that, interpreting my silence for capitulation. She began phrasing her statements as jokes. "Be careful," she said with a giggle, "or she'll cut us off." Everyone laughed. I did not. One evening, she handed my father a stack of papers on the kitchen counter. "These are merely estimations," she explained pleasantly. "I figured we could look over choices together." I recognized the logo on the main page. My bank. That night, I did not sleep. I laid in bed, listening to the house breathe, the pipes pounding and the air conditioner turning on and off. I stared at the ceiling and felt something settle within me. Not anger, but clarity. The following morning, I went for a run before dawn. Cold air scorched my lungs, keeping them steady and grounded. With each stride, I relived everything I'd seen and avoided because it was easier than face the truth. Margaret Hale refused aid. She wanted control, and my father let her take it. When I returned, Margaret Hale was already dressed and drinking coffee at the counter. She smiled when she saw me, as if nothing was wrong. "Morning," she answered. "Sleep well?" "Fine," I said. She tilted her head. "You've been quiet lately." "I have been listening." Her smile hardly flashed for a second. That afternoon I made my first call, but not to my father or to Margaret Hale. I called the legal aid agency. I didn't give them names at first. I outlined facts, hypotheses, and possibilities. The cop on the other end listened intently before asking a question that felt my stomach knot. "Did you approve any of this?" "No." "Then you are right to be concerned." Concerned. Not dramatic, and not paranoid. Validated. By the time I hung up, the shape of what I needed to do had become evident. I was not going to dispute with Margaret Hale. I was not going to plead with my father. And I was not about to wait for another border to be crossed. I was going to prepare. Margaret Hale made one last attempt that evening, softly and calculatedly. "You know," she added, putting her hand on my arm. "We do everything for this family." I met her gaze. "My money is not." Her hand dropped. She didn't say anything else, but as I walked away I felt it. The shift. The knowledge that I was not simply pushing back. I was no longer able to be managed, and that terrified her more than anything I could say. Because people like Margaret Hale were not afraid of confrontation. They were concerned about losing their negotiating position. I did not discover the truth all at once. It came in fragments. Little, everyday objects that only became hazardous when combined. The first was a letter that was not intended for me. It arrived while I was back at base, forwarded from my father's address. The envelope had been opened and sloppily resealed before being thrown into the outgoing mail pile as an afterthought. Inside was a note from a credit card firm thanking my father for his recent request about balance transfers and authorized users. The name on the account was not his. That was my. I sat on the edge of my bunk, the paper quivering slightly in my hands, and felt that chilly, unmistakable sensation creep up my spine. Not fear, but recognition. The type you get when something you suspected finally comes into the light and stares you in the face. I quickly dialed the phone number listed on the letter. The representative spoke calmly, professionally, and carefully. She affirmed what I had previously known. Someone had used my personal details to obtain account access choices. Not successfully or yet, but deliberately. Is there a reason why someone would believe they can achieve that? She asked. I recalled Margaret Hale's touch on my arm. My father's quiet. The word family is utilized as a key. No, I responded, there isn't. I secured everything that afternoon. New passwords, security questions, and verbal passcodes. I designated my accounts for increased monitoring. The woman on the call guided me through each step, her voice firm and encouraging. You did the right thing by calling early, she added before hanging up. Early? That term lingered because it implied that something worse may have occurred if I hadn't. The following element fell into place during my next trip home. I was looking for an old notebook where my mother used to maintain lists. Nothing too significant, just something to make the place feel less strange. I examined the hall closet, then the drawer under the phone. I finally opened the tiny cupboard in the study. That is where I located the folder. It was not hidden. That was a mistake. It sat on the middle shelf, buried between home guides and tax reports, labeled in precise handwriting as planning. Inside were printed emails, budget drafts, debt predictions, and a list of assets, specifically my assets. My name appeared repeatedly, neatly printed at the top of pages I'd never seen before. Notes in the margins mentioned temporary moves, family use, and eventual consolidation. My throat became dry. I stood there, folder open, listening to the sound of Margaret Hale moving around the kitchen, plates clinking, water running, the everyday music of a house that no longer felt like one. A single page silenced me. A handwritten note was folded and placed behind a spreadsheet. It stated, "She will not say no forever. When she understands responsibility, she'll see it's better this way." There were no signatures. There didn't have to be. I carefully closed the folder, placed it back into place, and quietly went out of the study. My hands were steady, but my heart wasn't. Margaret Hale discussed growing costs, inflation, and the unpredictability of the future over dinner that night. She spoke with the practiced cadence of someone laying the groundwork, without seeking permission. My father nodded. I observed them both, remembering all the years I'd defended his stillness and kindness, how many times I'd convinced myself he was just weary, grieving, or trying to maintain peace. Peace, I discovered, was pricey, and I was the one asked to pay for it. Later that evening my father knocked on the door. He stood awkwardly, hands in pockets, eyes fatigued. Your stepmother mentioned you seemed distant, he told me. I did not welcome him in. I found the folder, I said. He tensed. You went through our belongings. I recognized my own name, I explained, referring to arrangements I had not made. He breathed slowly. She was simply thinking forward. For who? She's worried about the house. About us. So what about me? He looked away. That was my response. After he went, I perched on the side of the bed and let myself to feel it. Not fury, not grief, just a dull aching from clarity. The realization that my father was not being influenced. He was participating. The following morning I called the fraud department. This time I didn't use hypotheticals. I described the letters, questions, documents, handwritten notes, and addresses. The tone on the other end changed immediately. Don't confront them, the agent said. Continue documenting. We will open a file. A file? It sounded little and professional, but it held weight. By the time I returned to base, I had established a system. I scanned all of the documents I found. I photographed handwritten notes. I preserved emails and documented talks, including dates, hours, and exact phrasing. I stored copies in 2 secure locations. I learned about the laws that were relevant to my accounts, state, and situation. The military had taught me to prepare for contingencies, so I did. Margaret Hale saw the difference before my father did. "You've been really busy," she replied over the phone, her voice light. "You hardly tell us anything anymore." "I'm focused," I said. "That is good," she remarked. "We all need to do our share." I nearly laughed. Instead, I ended the call and recorded her statements in my journal. The final piece arrived unexpectedly. An email from a loan officer was accidentally forwarded to me instead of my father. A short apology, followed by an attachment. A draft application collateral detailed estimated future income. Mine. That's when I knew. This was not excessive. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a strategy. Strategies could be dismantled. I didn't get much sleep that night. I lay awake, listening to the familiar sounds of the barracks, the rhythmic breathing around me, and the hum of fluorescent lights. I remembered my mother, how meticulous she had been, how she labeled everything, and how she used to say that preparation was a form of love. I finally realized what she meant. By daybreak, the anguish had turned to resolution. They interpreted my silence as consent. They assumed my distance indicated stupidity. They were wrong. They would soon find out how wrong they were. I did not change my behavior right away. This would have been too obvious. People who assume control panic when they detect resistance, and panic makes them sloppy, but only if they are first made to feel safe. So I remained polite. I answered Margaret Hale's calls. I replied to my father's messages. During video chats, I smiled and discussed work without going into detail. I inquired about the house, their health, and other topics that made me appear interested, but received no response. Inside, I was creating something precise. Every morning before work, I went over my notes, dates, times, statements, and the language Margaret Hale used when she thought she was being subtle. My father deferred instead of intervening. I treated it as I had been trained to treat intelligence. Verify, confirm, and document. Emotion was ineffective here. The structure was not. I opened a new account with a different bank that my family had never used. I redirected my deposits. I set up alerts on every existing account. I froze my credit. When the confirmation emails arrived, I saved them in a folder labeled Simply Evidence. I contacted legal assistance again, this time with specifics, names, documents, and screenshots. The officer did not interrupt. After I finished, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "This isn't a misunderstanding," he said calmly. "This is attempted financial exploitation." Hearing it said aloud had an effect on me. It removed the final layer of doubt. This wasn't a family conflict. It was considered misconduct. "What are my options?" I inquired. He outlined them clearly. Civil remedies, precautionary measures, and, if necessary, criminal escalation. He emphasized choice and control. "You decide how far this goes," he explained. That night I contacted the bank again. Not the general line, but the fraud unit that is handling my case. I asked questions. I learned the procedures. I learned about timelines. I learned which types of documentation were considered important and which were ignored. Margaret Hale messaged me while I was on the phone, just checking in. "Your father has been stressed. We are all worried about you. I've saved it." The next step was the most challenging. I had to let them believe it was working. I casually mentioned that doing everything alone was exhausting. I said I was overwhelmed. Margaret Hale heard uncertainty in my voice for the first time. She leaned in immediately. "You don't have to do this on your own," she said gently. "Families share burdens." "I understand," I replied. "I'm just not sure where to start." Her voice grew warmer. "Your father can help. We both can." That was when I realized she believed she had won. Over the next few weeks, she pushed carefully. A suggestion here, a form there, and a remark about how much easier it would be if everything was centralized. She framed it as support, but the paperwork revealed a different story. Each attempt was recorded in my file. My father avoided my gaze whenever the subject came up. He never stopped her. The silence became its own record. I began rehearsing the conversation I knew would come. Not emotionally, but strategically. What I would and would not say, where I would pause, and where I would allow silence to do the work. I deliberately chose this setting. A family dinner on neutral ground with witnesses close enough to matter but not enough to turn it into theater. I didn't want a spectacle. I wanted clarity. Margaret Hale looked stunning in the evening. She was always confident when she felt in control. She discussed the future, stability, and how proud she was of our girl. Halfway through dessert, she mentioned it. "We've been thinking," she said, looking at my father. "Maybe it's time to formalize some things." I set down my spoon. "What things?" I inquired. She smiled. "Just precautions in case something happens." "Whom should I ask?" She hesitated for a moment. "To each of us." I nodded slowly. "I have already secured my accounts." Her smile wavered. "Oh yes," I said, "and I've spoken with my bank and legal counsel." The table became quiet. My father's face had lost its color. Margaret Hale's eyes became sharper. "Why would you do that?" she inquired, her voice light but strained. "Because someone attempted to access my finances without my permission," I stated evenly. She laughed softly. "This sounds dramatic." I replied. "It is documented." Silence. "I warned you." I continued, turning to face my father. "I set a boundary." He swallowed. "We were simply trying to help." "You were trying to make a decision for me," I said. "There is a difference." Margaret Hale leaned back in her chair, her expression cool. "You are overreacting." "No," I replied. "I am prepared." I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I did not threaten. I simply told them that the quiet version of myself was no longer present. After dinner, Margaret Hale attempted to corner me in the kitchen. "You are turning this into something ugly," she said sharply. "It already was," I said. "I just stopped pretending it wasn't." She looked at me, calculating. "You think you have power here?" "I know I do," I replied. That was the first time she looked scared because she realized what my father didn't. I wasn't bluffing and I wasn't emotional. I was methodical, and methodical people do not stop once they begin. Margaret Hale came up with the idea for dinner. She presented it as a gesture of reconciliation, which should have been my first clue. People who have wronged you rarely seek peace, unless they are trying to regain ground. She suggested inviting the extended family and aunt. I barely spoke to a cousin who constantly asked invasive questions, as well as a few family friends who remembered me as a quiet child and continued to treat me as such. "It'll be nice," Margaret Hale said over the phone. "An opportunity to reconnect. We're all under a lot of stress lately." She also used the word stress to mean leverage. I consented immediately. It surprised her. I could hear it in the pause before her response when she recalibrated. "Good," she replied. "I will make your favorite." I did not correct her. She could never recall what that was. The evening arrived crisp and cool, the kind of autumn night that filled the house with the aroma of roasted vegetables and cinnamon. Margaret Hale had carefully set the table, candles spaced perfectly, and her fine china laid out like a stage. She wore a cream-colored sweater, which made her appear soft and approachable. My father hovered near the sink, drying the same glass repeatedly. The guests arrived in groups, with coats and chatter filling the hallway. Hugs and compliments were shared. Someone mentioned how proud they were that I was serving my country. Margaret Hale seized that opportunity. "She's doing very well," she said cheerfully. "We're very grateful. Many families do not have that level of security." There it was again. I caught my father's eye. He looked away. Dinner proceeded slowly. Stories, laughter, and the clink of silverware. Margaret Hale effortlessly steered conversations, always returning to responsibility, planning, and the importance of thinking ahead. I waited. It arrived during dessert. My aunt smiled as she said this. "Do you intend to serve in the military for the foreseeable future?" "Perhaps," I replied. "I enjoy what I do." Margaret Hale nodded. "And with that kind of income, she'll have plenty of options." I set down my fork. "What kind of options exist?" I asked. She blinked. "Well, you know, investing, helping family, and ensuring that everyone is taken care of." The table became quiet, not tense, and curious. I reached into my bag and set a slim envelope on the table between us. Margaret Hale's eyes immediately focused on it. "What is that?" she asked. "A summary," I said. "I've recently engaged in some financial activity." My father stiffened. Margaret Hale laughed lightly. "Is now really the time?" "I think it's the perfect time," I replied. I did not open the envelope. I did not slide papers across the table. I let it sit there, closed, its weight heavier than anything inside. "My bank has contacted me," I continued calmly. "There have been numerous attempts to access my accounts, requests for information, and draft applications, none of which were authorized." The room became very still. My aunt looked at us, uncertain. Someone cleared their throat. Margaret Hale quickly responded, "That sounds like a mistake. Banks frequently make errors." "Not like this," I replied. "Not repeatedly. My father has finally spoken. We can discuss this later." "I'm comfortable discussing it now," I said. "Because it's already been discussed publicly." Margaret Hale's jaws tightened. "I opened a file," I continued, "with the fraud department, and I've sought legal counsel." There it was. The shift. The moment when the air changed. Margaret Hale's hand trembled when she reached for her water glass. She took another sip, her smile rigid. "This is unnecessary," she stated. "We are family." "That's precisely why it matters," I responded. Nobody spoke. The candles flickered. I turned to face my father. "I warned you. I set a boundary. It was crossed." He looked down at his plate. "I'm not accusing anyone tonight," I stated. "I am informing you. A professional meeting is planned for the near future. We will discuss what happens next." Margaret Hale leaned back in her chair, her calm slipping just enough to reveal the calculation beneath. "You are threatening us." "No," I said. "I'm providing clarity." The remainder of the dinner passed in a blur. Conversations resumed, forced and awkward. People avoided my gaze. When the guests began to leave, Margaret Hale hugged them tightly, her smile unwavering. Anyone watching thought the evening had gone well. Margaret Hale turned on me and hissed, "You humiliated me," as the last car drove away. "I told the truth," I answered. "You did this on purpose." "Yes." My father stood between us, his shoulders slumped. "Can we just calm down?" "I am calm," you replied. Margaret Hale laughed sharply and brittlely. "That's the point. You think you've won something? I think you understand now. I told you. And that's enough for tonight." She stared at the envelope that was still sitting on the table. "What's inside it?" I said. "You'll see at the meeting." She opened her mouth to argue before closing it again. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked uncertain. That night I got the best sleep I'd had in months. Because here's the deal with leverage. Once it's exposed, it stops working. Margaret Hale knew it. The meeting was scheduled for 10:30 on a Wednesday. Not at the house. Not at a cafe. Neutral ground. An office with glass walls and neutral art. The kind of place designed to keep emotions from staining the furniture. I chose it deliberately. Emotions blur edges. Paper sharpens them. My father arrived first. He looked older than he had a week earlier. His shoulders were hunched. His tie knotted too tightly, as if he'd pulled it that way to remind himself he was still in control of something. He nodded at me when I entered, the gesture stiff and uncertain. Margaret Hale arrived nearly 5 minutes late. She wore a dark blazer and heels that clicked sharply against the floor each step, announcing her presence like she still believed this was a stage she could command. She smiled at the receptionist, at the framed certificates on the wall, at everyone except me. We sat. The mediator introduced herself, then the attorney I'd retained. Quiet, precise, a woman who spoke only when necessary. I noticed Margaret Hale watching her hands instead of her face. That told me something. "Let's begin," the mediator said. I didn't speak first. Margaret Hale did. "This is all very dramatic," she said lightly. "We're here because of a misunderstanding." My attorney slid a folder across the table. "It's documented," she said. Margaret Hale's smile tightened. The mediator cleared her throat. "Perhaps we should start with the facts." So we did. Timeline. Dates, attempted access, unauthorized inquiries, draft applications, the handwritten note. The collateral listing expected future income, mine. Each item was presented calmly, methodically, no accusations, no raised voices. Just facts. My father stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched. Margaret Hale shifted in her chair, crossing and uncrossing her legs. "This doesn't prove intent," she said. "People plan. Families plan for other people's money," my attorney asked. Silence. The mediator turned to me. "What outcome are you seeking?" I took a breath. I had rehearsed this. Not the words, but the steadiness. "First," I said, "a formal acknowledgement that my finances are mine alone. No shared access, no inquiries, no future planning without my written consent." Margaret Hale opened her mouth, closed it. "Second," I continued, "a signed statement confirming that any prior attempts to access or leverage my accounts were unauthorized." My father flinched. "Third," I said, "a commitment that my name, Income and expected future earnings will not be used in any financial discussions, applications or representations going forward. Margaret Hale leaned forward. And if we don't agree? I met her gaze. Then the fraud file moves forward. The room went very quiet. My father has finally spoken. You'd do that to us? I looked at him. I already did it to protect myself. He rubbed his face with both hands. We were just trying to make things easier. For whom? I asked. He didn't answer. The mediator interjected gently. There are alternatives to escalation, settlement, boundaries. That's what I'm offering, I said. Margaret Hale laughed softly. You're enjoying this. No, I replied. I'm ending it. She turned to my father. You're going to let her do this? He hesitated. That hesitation, the space where he should have defended me years ago, was all the confirmation I needed. My attorney placed another document on the table. This outlines the terms, she said. If signed, no further action will be taken. Margaret Hale scanned the page quickly, her face changed as she read. This limits us, she said sharply. It protects me, I replied. And what about family? She demanded. Family doesn't require access to my accounts, I said. She looked at my father again. Say something. He swallowed. Margaret Hale. Maybe we should just sign. Her head snapped toward him. After everything I've done for you. The mediator raised a hand. Let's keep this productive. Margaret Hale leaned back, her composure cracking. You're choosing her over me. My father stared at the table. I'm choosing to stop this from getting worse. She laughed, then bitter, sharp. You always do this. You retreat. I watched them detached, as if observing a pattern finally visible from the outside. I'm not asking you to choose sides, I said. I'm drawing a line. The mediator slid the pen across the table. Margaret Hale didn't reach for it. My father did. Wait, she said. If we sign this, what happens? The matter ends here, my attorney replied. Provided there are no further violations. Margaret Hale's fingers curled into her palm. And if we don't, then the documentation is forwarded, I said, today. She stared at me. Really? Looked at me for the first time without calculation. You think you're so disciplined? She said quietly. So controlled. I am, I replied. That's why this works. She turned away, jaw tight. My father signed first. The sound of the pen on paper was louder than I expected. Margaret Hale stared at the document for a long moment, then snatched the pen and signed with a sharp, angry stroke. The mediator collected the papers. Thank you, she said. We'll finalize this. As we stood, my father lingered. Can we talk? He asked me quietly. I shake my head. Not today. Margaret Hale walked past us without a word, her heels echoing down the hallway, each step heavy with something like defeat. Outside the air was cool and clear. I took a breath and felt something loosen inside me. Not relief exactly, but completion. I hadn't won. I had concluded. And sometimes that was better. The silence afterward was unfamiliar. Not the awkward kind that followed arguments, or the brittle quiet that settled over a room when someone refused to apologize. This was different. It was clean, unoccupied, like a space that had finally been cleared of furniture you never chose in the first place. I returned to base 3 days later. The drive was long, stretching through flat highways and early morning fog. I kept the radio off. I wanted to hear my own thoughts, to test how they sounded now that I wasn't constantly defending myself inside my head. They were quieter. My father sent a short message that week. Just a few words. I hope you're fine. I did not respond. Not because I was angry. Anger would have required energy I no longer wanted to give. But because the message was incomplete, hope without accountability was just another form of avoidance. I had spent years filling in gaps for him. I was done doing that. Margaret Hale didn't reach out at all. I learned later through a relative who still thought updates were helpful, that she was telling people I'd become cold, that the military had changed me, that I'd turned money into something ugly. I let her have that story. People like Margaret Hale needed narratives. They needed to be wronged, misunderstood, diminished by forces beyond their control. I didn't need to correct her. Anyone who mattered had already seen enough. What surprised me most was how little I missed the house. I'd expected grief, nostalgia, a sense of loss for the place where I'd grown up. But when I thought about it, the house I missed hadn't existed for a long time. Not since my mother died. Everything after that had been a version edited by someone else. On my next free weekend back, I drove to the cemetery. It was quiet, the grass trimmed neatly, the headstones catching the afternoon light. I brought nothing with me. No flowers, no prepared words. I didn't need them. I stood in front of my mother's grave and told her the truth. I handled it, I said softly. I didn't let them take what wasn't theirs. I thought about the girl I'd been when she died, how desperate I'd been to keep things together, how willing I'd been to disappear to make space for other people's comfort. I wished I could tell her that it hadn't been weakness, just youth, just love misdirected. I learned how to say no, I said, and how to mean it. The wind moved through the trees, gentle and steady. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for permission to breathe. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. My finances stayed exactly where they belonged. My name stayed off everything that wasn't mine. The fraud file was closed, marked resolved. The folder labeled evidence went into storage, untouched, but available. Not a threat, just a reminder. My father tried once more 5 months later. A voicemail this time. He sounded exhausted. Older. I should have protected you, he said. I did not. I'm sorry. I listened to it 3 times. Then I archived it. Apologies didn't rebuild trust. They acknowledged damage after it was done. I wasn't cruel enough to deny him the chance to reflect, but I wasn't obligated to resume a relationship just because he finally understood the cost of his silence. Some lessons arrived late. That didn't make them my responsibility. The military gave me structure. My mother gave me values. And this experience, unwanted, exhausting, necessary, gave me something else entirely. Boundaries. Not walls, not punishments, just clear lines drawn with intention. I didn't walk away with satisfaction. There was no victory lap, no dramatic sense of triumph. What I gained was quieter than that. I gained ownership of my life. I gained the understanding that respect didn't require permission, and that being difficult was sometimes just another word for being unwilling to be used. Most of all, I learned that family wasn't defined by access. It was defined by care. And care. Real care never needed to be extracted.